The name Early African Church is given to the Christian communities inhabiting the region known politically as Roman Africa, and comprised geographically within the following limits, namely, the Mediterranean littoral between Cyrenaica on the east and the river Ampsaga on the west, that part of it that faces the Atlantic Ocean being called Mauretania. The evangelization of Africa followed much the same lines as those traced by Roman civilization history before the Arab conquest. The delimitation of the ecclesiastical boundaries of the African Church is a matter of great difficulty. Again and again the Roman political authority rearranged the provincial divisions, and on various occasions the ecclesiastical authorities conformed the limits of the respective jurisdictions to those of the civil power. These limits, however, were not only liable to successive rectification, but in some cases they were not even clearly marked. Parts of Mauretania always remained independent, the mountainous region to the west of the Oris Mountains, and the plateau above the Tel never became Roman. The highlands of the Sahara and all the country west of the Atlas Range were inhabited by the nomad tribes of the Gata-Ilalai, and there are neither churches nor definite ecclesiastical organizations to be found there. Christianity filtered in, so to speak, little by little. Bishoprics were founded among the converts as the need for them arose, were moved, possibly, from place to place, and disappeared, without leaving a trace of their existence. The historical period of the African Church begins in 180 with groups of martyrs. At of somewhat later date the writings of Tertullian tell us how rapidly African Christianity had grown. It had passed the Roman military lines, and spread among the peoples to the south and southeast of the Ori. About the year 200 there was a violent persecution at Carthage and in the provinces held by the Romans. We gain information as to its various phases from the martyrdom of St. Perpetua and the treatises of Tertullian. Christianity, however, did not even then cease to make distant conquests. Christian epitaphs are to be found at Cyrenaica, dated 227, and at Tipasa, dated 238. These dates are assured. If we rely on texts less definite, we may admit that the evangelization of northern Africa began very early. By the opening of the 3rd century there was a large Christian population in the towns and even in the country districts, which included not only the poor, but also persons of the highest rank. A council held at Carthage about the year 220 was attended by 18 bishops from the province of Numidia. Another council, held in the time of Cyprian, about the middle of the 3rd century, was attended by 87 bishops. At this period the African Church went through a very grave crisis. The Emperor Decius published an edict that made many martyrs and confessors, and not a few apostates. A certain bishop, followed by his whole community, was to be seen sacrificing to the gods. The apostates and the timid who had bought a certificate of apostasy for money became so numerous as to believe they could lay down the law to the Church, and demand the restoration to ecclesiastical communion, a state of affairs that gave rise to controversies and deplorable troubles. Yet the Church of Africa had martyrs, even at such a time. The persecutions at the end of the 3rd, and at the beginning of the 4th century did not only make martyrs, they also gave rise to a minority that claimed that Christians could deliver the sacred books and the archives of the Church to the officers of the state, without lapsing from the faith. The accession of Constantine found the African Church torn apart by controversies and heresies. Catholics and Donatists contended not only in polemics, but also in a violent and bloody way. A law of Constantine deprived the Donatists Donatists of their churches, most of which they had taken from the Catholics. They had, however, grown so powerful that even such a measure failed to crush them. They were so numerous that a Donatist council, held at Carthage in 327, was attended by 270 bishops. Attempts at reconciliation, suggested by the Emperor Constantius II, only widened the breach and led to armed repression, an ever-growing disquiet, and an enmity that became increasingly embittered. Yet, in the very midst of these troubles, the primate of Carthage, Gratus, declared, "God has restored Africa to religious unity." Julian's accession and his permission to all religious exiles to return to their homes added to the troubles of the African Church. A Donatist bishop sat in the seceded see of Carthage, in opposition to the Orthodox bishop. One act of violence followed another and begat new conflicts. About this period, Optatus, bishop of Milevi, began to combat the sect by his writings. A few years later, Augustine, converted at Milan, returned to his native land, and entered the lists against every kind of error. Paganism had by the time ceased to be a menace to the Church. In 399 the temples were closed at Carthage. Nevertheless, the energy and genius of Augustine were abundantly occupied in training the clergy and instructing the faithful, as well as in theological controversy with the heretics. For 40 years, from 390 to 430, the councils of Carthage, which reunited a great part of the African episcopate, public discussions with the Donatists, sermons, homilies, scriptural commentaries, followed almost without interval, an unparalleled activity that had commensurate results. Pelagianism, which had made great strides in Africa, was condemned at the Council of Carthage in 412. Donatism, also, and semi-Pelagianism were stricken to death at an hour when political events of the utmost gravity changed the history and the destiny of the African Church. Conflict between Carthage and Rome on the regulation of the African Church came to the fore when Apirius of Sicca appealed his excommunication to Rome, and thus challenging the authority of Carthage. Count Boniface had summoned the Vandals to Africa in 426, and by 429 the invasion was completed. The barbarians advanced rapidly and made themselves masters of cities and provinces. In 430, Augustine died during the siege of Hippo. 9 years later, Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, took possession of Carthage. Then began for the African Church an era of persecution of a kind hitherto unknown. The Vandals were Arians. Not only did they wish to establish their own Arianism, but they were bent on the destruction of Catholicism. Churches the invasion had left standing were either transferred to the Arians or withdrawn from the Catholics and closed to public worship. The intervention of the Emperor Zeno and the conclusion of a treaty of peace with Gaiseric were followed by a transient calm. The churches were opened, and the Catholics were allowed to choose a bishop, but the death of Gaiseric, and the edict of Hunric, in 484, made matters worse than before. A contemporary writer, Victor of Vita, has told us what we know of this long history of the Vandal persecution. Even in such a condition of peril, the Christians of Africa did not display much courage in the face of oppression. During the last years of Vandal rule in Africa, Fulgentius, bishop of Ruspa, exercised a fortunate influence over the princes of the Vandal dynasty, who were no longer completely barbaric, but whose culture, Holy Roman and Byzantine, equaled that of the native subjects. Yet the Vandal monarchy, which had lasted for nearly a century, seemed less firmly established than at its beginning. Hilderic, who succeeded Thrasimund in 523, was too cultured and too mild a prince to impose his will on others. Jelima made an attempt to deprive him of power, and proclaimed king of the Vandals in 500. 631, marched on Carthage and dethroned Hilderic. His cause appeared to be completely successful, and his authority firmly established, when a Byzantine fleet appeared off the coast of Africa. The Battle of Ad-Decimum won the initiative for the invading Byzantines. The taking of Carthage, the flight of Gelimer, and the Battle of Tricamarum, about the middle of December, completed the destruction and the disappearance. The victor, Belisarius, had but to show himself in order to reconquer the greater part of the coast, and to place the cities under the authority of the Emperor Justinian. A council held at Carthage in 534 was attended by 220 bishops representing all the churches. It issued a decree forbidding the public exercise of Arian worship. The establishment of Byzantine rule, however, was far from restoring unity to the African Church. The councils of Carthage brought together the bishops of Proconsular Africa, Byzacena, and Numidia, but those of Tripolitana and Mauretania were absent. Mauretania had, in fact, regained its political autonomy. During the Vandal period, a native dynasty had been set up, and the Byzantine army of occupation never succeeded in conquering a part of the country so far from the base at Carthage. The reign of Justinian marks a sad period in the history of the African Church, due to the part taken by the clergy in the matter known as that of the Three Chapters. While one part of the episcopate wasted its time and energies in fruitless theological discussions, others failed of their duty. It was under these circumstances that Pope Gregory the Great sent men to Africa, whose lofty character contributed greatly to increase the prestige of the Roman Church. The notary Hilarius became in some sense a papal legate with authority over the African bishops. He left them in no doubt as to their duty, instructed or reprimanded them, and summoned councils in the Pope's name. With the help of the Metropolitan of Carthage, he succeeded in restoring unity, peace, and ecclesiastical discipline in the African Church, which drew strength from so fortunate a change even so surely as the See of Rome regained in respect and authority. The Arab conquest. This renewal of vigor, however, was not of long duration. The Arabs, who had conquered Rome and Egypt, made their way further west into Africa. In 642 they occupied Barca and Cyrenaica. In 643 they conquered part of Tripolitana. In 647 the Caliph Othman gave orders for a direct attack on Africa, and an army that had gained a victory at Sabiatla withdrew on payment of a large ransom. Some years of respite ensued. The early African Church showed its firm attachment to orthodoxy by remaining loyal to Pope Martin I in his conflict with the Emperor of Byzantium. The last 40 years of the 7th century witnessed the gradual fall of the fragments of Byzantine Africa into the hands of the Arabs, including Byzantine Egypt. The native Berber people, a tribe which before this had seemed aimed towards conversion to Christianity, moved in a short time to conversion to Islam. Carthage was taken by the Arabs in 695. 2 years later it was re-entered by the patrician John, but only for a brief period. In 698 Hassan once more took possession of the capital of northern Africa. Fate of indigenous Christianity in northwest Africa after the Arab conquest. The conventional historical view was that the conquest of North Africa by the Islamic Umayyad Caliphate between AD 647 to 709 effectively ended Christianity in northern Africa for several centuries. A prevailing view is that the Church at the time lacked the backbone of a monastic tradition and was still suffering from the aftermath of heresies, including the so-called Donatist heresy. and this contributed to the earlier obliteration of the church in the present-day Maghreb. Some historians contrast this with the strong monastic tradition in Coptic Egypt, which is credited as a factor that allowed the Coptic Church to remain the majority faith in the country until around after the 14th century. However, new scholarship has appeared that disputes this. There are reports that the Roman Catholic faith persisted in the region from Tripolitania to present-day Morocco for several centuries after the completion of the Arab conquest by 700. A Christian community is recorded in 1114 in Qala in central Algeria. There is also evidence of religious pilgrimages after 850 to tombs of Catholic saints outside of the city of Carthage, and evidence of religious contacts with Christians of Arab Spain. In addition, calendar reforms adopted in Europe at this time were disseminated amongst the indigenous Christians of Tunis, which would have not been possible had there been an absence of contact with Rome. There are also Christian graves at Enhila south of Tripoli, dated from 945 to 1003, and Qiran dated 1007, 1019 and 1046. Local Catholicism came under pressure when the Muslim fundamentalist regimes of the Almohads and Almoravids came into power, and the record shows demands made that the local Christians of Tunis to convert to Islam. We still have reports of Christian inhabitants and a bishop in the city of Kairouan around 1150 AD, who are a significant report, since this city was founded by Arab Muslims around 680 AD as their administrative center after the conquest. A letter in Catholic Church archives from the 14th century shows that there were still 4 bishoprics left in North Africa, admittedly a sharp decline from the over 400 bishoprics in existence at the time of the Arab conquest. Berber Christians continued to live in Tunis and Nezah in the south of Tunisia up until the early 15th century, and the first quarter of the 15th century. We even read that the native Christians of Tunis, though much assimilated, extended their church, perhaps because the last Christians from all over the Maghreb had gathered there. By 1830, when the French came as colonial conquerors to Algeria and Tunis, local Catholicism had been extinguished. The growth of Catholicism in the region after the French conquest was built on European colonizers and settlers, and these immigrants and their descendants for the most part left when the countries of the region became independent. Today there are communities of Christians, mostly Roman Catholics and Protestant, in Algeria, Mauretania, Morocco, Libya and Tunisia. Most of the Roman Catholics in Greater Maghreb are of French, Spanish, and Italian descent who immigrated during the colonial era, while some are foreign missionaries or immigrant worker. There is also a Christian communities of Berber or Arab descent in Greater Maghreb countries, mostly converted during the modern era or under and after French colonialism. Due to the exodus of the Pieds Noirs in the 1960s, there are more North African Christians of Berber or Arab descent live in France than in Greater Maghreb. Recently, the Protestant community of Berber or Arab descent has experienced significant growth, and conversions to Christianity, especially to evangelicalism, is common in Algeria, especially in the Kabylie, Morocco and Tunisia. A 2015 study estimates 380,000 Muslims converted to Christianity in Algeria. Liturgy. The liturgy of the African Church is known to us from the writings of the Fathers, but there exists no complete work, no liturgical book, belonging to it. The writings of Tertullian, of St. Cyprian, of St. Augustine are full of valuable indications that indicate the liturgy of Africa presented many characteristic points of contact with the liturgy of the Roman Church. The liturgical year comprised the feasts in honor of our Lord and a great number of feasts of martyrs, which are offset by certain days of penance. Africa, however, does not seem to have conformed rigorously in this matter with what was else customary. The station days. The fast of these days was not continued beyond the third hour afternoon. Easter in the African Church had the same character as in other churches. It continued to draw a part of the year into its orbit by fixing the date of Lent and of the Paschal season, while Pentecost and the Ascension likewise gravitated around it. Christmas and the Epiphany were kept clearly apart, and had fixed dates. The cultus of the martyrs is not always to be distinguished from that of the dead, and it is only by degrees that the line was drawn between the martyrs who were to be invoked and the dead who were to be prayed for. The prayer for a place of refreshment, refrigerium, bears witness to the belief of an interchange of help between the living and the departed. In addition, moreover, to the prayer for the dead, we find in Africa the prayer for certain classes of the living. Dialects. Several languages were used simultaneously by the people of Africa. The northern part seems at first to have been a Latin-speaking country. Indeed, previous to and during the first centuries of our era we find there a flourishing Latin literature, many schools, and famous rhetoricians. However, Greek was currently spoken at Carthage in the 2nd century. Some of Tertullian's treatises were written also in Greek. The steady advance of Roman civilization caused the neglect and abandonment of the tongue. At the beginning of the 3rd century an African, chosen at random, would have expressed himself more easily in Greek than in Latin. 200 years later, Street, Augustine and the poet Dracontius had at best but a slight knowledge of Greek. As to local dialects, we know little. No work of Christian literature written in Punic has come down to us, though there can be no doubt that the clergy and faithful used a language much spoken in Carthage and in the coast towns of the proconsular province. The lower and middle classes spoke Punic, and the Circumcellians were to be among the last of its defenders. The Christian writers almost wholly ignore the native Libyan or Berber dialect. St. Augustine, indeed, tells us that this writing was only in use among the nomad tribes.